Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, as Special Counsel Robert Mueller continues his probe into Russian meddling into the 2016 election, we take a look back at Washington's record of meddling in elections across the globe. By one count, the United States has interfered in more than 80 foreign elections between 1946 and 2000. And that doesn't count U.S.-backed coups and invasions. Former CIA Director James Woolley recently joked about the U.S. record of meddling overseas during an interview with Laura Ingraham on Fox News.
Have we ever tried to meddle in other countries' elections?
Oh, probably, but it was for the good of the system in order to avoid the communists from taking over. For example, in Europe, in 47, 48, 49, the Greeks and the Italians, we
don't do that now, though? We don't mess around other people's elections,
only for a very good cause.
Can you do that? Do a Vine video on a former CIA director.
Only for a very good cause in the interests of democracy.
All right, thank you.
The list of countries where the U.S. has interfered is long. In 1893, the U.S. helped overthrow the Kingdom of Hawaii. 5 years later, in 1898, the U.S. invaded and occupied Cuba and Puerto Rico. A year later, it was the Philippines. Early 20th century interventions included Nicaragua, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, all in the 1910s.
In 1953, the U.S. helped overthrow the Iranian government. A year later, in 1954, the U.S.-backed coup in Guatemala, overthrowing the democratically elected leader of Guatemala, Jacobo Arbenz. Then in the 60s, the list grew to include, once again, the Dominican Republic, Indonesia, and the Congo. And that's just a partial list. Even with the end of the Cold War, U.S. interference overseas did not end. Next week marks the 15th anniversary of the U.S. invasion of Iraq to topple the government of Saddam Hussein. We now go to Stephen Keinzer, former New York Times foreign correspondent who writes about world affairs for the Boston Globe. He's the author of a number of books, including Overthrow, America's Century of Regime Change from Hawaii to Iraq, All the Shah's Men, An American Coup and the Roots of Middle East Terror. He's written the book Bitter Fruit about the coup in Guatemala. And his latest book is The True Flag, Theodore Roosevelt, Mark Twain, and the Birth of American Empire. Stephen Keinzer, we welcome you back to Democracy Now! To talk, sadly, about the very same issue. I'm not quite sure where to begin, whether to go back to the beginning, but let's start since it was 65 years ago. In Iran, in 1953, in March of 1953, the U.S. was in full swing making plans for overthrowing the government of the democratically elected leader, Mohammad Mossadegh. Can you talk about what the U.S. did in Iran then, so well known throughout Iran, but most people in this country have no idea?
Early in the 20th century, the people of Iran began moving towards democracy. It was a very difficult struggle. It was back and forth. But finally, after the Second World War, democracy did emerge in Iran. It was the one parenthesis, the one period of real democracy that we've had in Iran over the last 100 years. So the problem came when the Iranians chose the wrong leader. They did something that the United States never likes. They chose a leader who wanted to put the interests of his own country ahead of the interests of the United States. And that alarmed the West, and particularly the United States. Mossadegh's first move was to nationalize Iranian oil. We thought this would be a terrible example for the rest of the world. We didn't want to start this process going in other countries. So in order to set an example, the United States decided we would work with the British to overthrow the elected democratic government of Iran. We sent a senior CIA officer who worked in the basement of the American embassy in Iran, organizing the coup. The coup finally succeeded in the summer of 1953. Mossadegh was overthrown, and more important, the democratic system in Iran was destroyed forever. This was not just an attack on one person, but an attack on democracy. And the reason why we attacked that democracy is the democracy produced the wrong person. So we like elections and democratic processes, but They have to produce the candidates we like, otherwise our approval disappears.
And the person he sent, that the U.S., the Dulles brothers sent into Iran with the suitcases of money to begin the process, Teddy Roosevelt's grandson?
That's right. Sometimes I wonder if there's something genetic in the Roosevelt family that predisposes them toward regime change. It is a kind of a quirk of history that the person who effectively projected the United States into the regime change era at the beginning of the 20th century, Teddy Roosevelt, had a grandson who went to Iran in the 1950s and carried out a regime change operation there. And there are similarities between the operations that they carried out.
Before you go on, Stephen, I wanted to go to a part of a trailer from an upcoming documentary titled Coup 53 about the 1953 British-American coup in Iran and the overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh, directed by the Iranian physicist turned award-winning documentary filmmaker Taqi Emirani.
I'm going to be telling the story of this man, Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh. He was our first democratically elected prime minister.
Nobody knows who Mossadegh was. Democratically elected prime minister of Iran.
In 1952, Time magazine named him Man of the Year because it nationalized Iranian oil and kicked the British out.
Mossadegh came along and threw them out. They were gone, gone, gone. The Iranian people had rejected the Shah's rule with blood. With blood, at bare hands, at front of tanks.
You had $1 million in cash to run the coup, right?
That's right.
Kermit Roosevelt was prepared to do whatever he had to do when he was given this mission by Allen Dulles to overthrow the democratic government of Iran.
But may I say this, at no time has the CIA engaged in any political activity or any intelligence activity that was not approved at the highest level.
That last voice, Allen Dulles, head of the CIA from 1952 to 1961. At the time, his brother, Secretary of State Dulles, was Secretary of State. We're talking about the overthrow of Iran for the British oil company that would later become British Petroleum. Is that right, Stephen Keinzer?
Yes, that company is now called BP. So you're seeing long-term effects of these interventions, and what you're seeing in Iran today 100% ties back to what we did in 1953. We like to have this idea that these operations are discrete. They're not going to have any long-term effects. We'll remove one government, place another favorable government in power, then everything will go fine, everybody will forget it, and it won't have any long-term effects. But if you look around the world, you can see that these kinds of operations to interfere in other countries' politics, what the CIA calls influence operations, actually not only often wind up devastating the target country, but in the end undermine the security of the United States.
Stephen Keinzer, I'd like to move to another part of the world, Nicaragua. Most people are familiar, obviously, with the Reagan-era attempts to overthrow the